Hello, listener. Let me know where you're watching from, and if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening.
A quiet sector that wasn't, the Ardennes, December 1944. By mid-December 1944, Allied commanders believed the Western Front was stabilizing. The Ardennes, heavily forested hills straddling Belgium and Luxembourg, were logged in staff maps as a quiet sector, ideal for rotating exhausted combat divisions out for rest. That assumption dictated deployment. Rear area units, supply depots, field hospitals, and signal centers were concentrated along the narrow roads. Many of those posts were staffed by women, Army Nurse Corps personnel, Women's Army Corps, WAC, clerks and switchboard operators, radio specialists attached to Signal Corps units. Operational plans treated them as safely behind the lines. Their camps lacked fortifications and heavy weapons. Yet in Berlin, Hitler and his generals were finalizing Operation Wacht am Rhein, a last-ditch offensive designed to punch through the Ardennes, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied front. The German concept depended on surprise, fog, and exactly this Allied complacency about safe rear areas. Who these women were, from classrooms to combat zones. The women scattered around the Ardennes in December 1944 looked nothing like propaganda posters of warriors. Many came from small American towns, a schoolteacher from Iowa who became a telephone operator, a nurse from Texas who had treated polio before learning battlefield triage, a bookish New England student who found herself decoding messages under blackout curtains. Most had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotism, family ties at the front, or the promise of a paying job in a still unequal labor market. Official doctrine classified them as noncombatants. Weapons training, if it existed at all, was cursory, a few hours with a carbine on some stateside range. Yet structurally, the late war front had shifted. Allied logistics and command posts now sat only a few miles behind infantry lines in order to support rapid offensives into Germany. That compression of space meant these women, mapped as rear echelon, were in fact perched on the fault line of any sudden breakthrough. December 16th, the sound of an offensive in headphones and teletypes. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the German offensive erupted under a carefully constructed screen of radio silence. Artillery barrages thundered through the mist, and armored columns, Panthers, Panzer IVs, Panzer tank destroyers, rolled out of the forests toward thin American lines. For women in signal centers at Bastogne, St. Vith, and smaller villages, the first trace of the attack was not the sound of guns but the sudden chaos on the net. Telephones rang without pause, circuits overloaded with frantic calls from regiments reporting tanks in the wire, broken code groups, desperate demands for reinforcements. WAC switchboard operators, hunched over manual patch panels, were the only living link between isolated battalions and higher headquarters. Simultaneously, radio operators with SCR-188 and SCR-300 sets fought static, overlapping transmissions, and German attempts at deception. In those first critical hours, holding the communications grid together meant the difference between a controlled withdrawal and complete operational blindness. Field hospitals on the front line overnight. Meanwhile, evacuation hospitals and clearing stations, designed to sit a safe distance behind the battle, found the battle coming to them. U.S. medical doctrine envisioned a chain, aid station, collecting station, field hospital, then evacuation hospitals deeper in the rear. In the Ardennes, that chain snapped. German plans aimed not only at infantry but at road junctions and supply nodes, exactly where hospitals had been sited for convenience. Nurses woke to the whine of incoming shells and the ominous grind of tracks on frozen roads. Under regulations, commanding officers were supposed to evaluate facilities in the face of enemy advance. In practice, that meant abandoning the gravely wounded who could not be moved. Many nurses refused. They improvised defensive routines, moving operating tables to cellars, sandbagging surgery tents, organizing orderlies and ambulatory patients into stretcher-bearing teams and fire parties. Motives were raw and personal: professional ethics, attachment to their boys, fear of what capture by the Wehrmacht or SS might mean for women in uniform. Bastogne's hidden nerve: women at the switchboard. Bastogne, a small town that sat atop a web of 7 roads, quickly became the focal point of German efforts and American resistance. The story is usually told through generals: McAuliffe's famous nuts, reply to a surrender demand, Patton's rapid turn north. But behind the command post walls, WAC signal women kept Bastogne wired to the outside world as the encirclement tightened. Their switchboards routed calls from artillery observation posts, quartermasters counting dwindling ammunition, and liaison officers begging for air resupply. German artillery targeted visible wires and junction boxes, forcing line crews, some of them women in signal units, to crawl into ditches amid shrapnel to splice cut cables. Maintaining even intermittent contact with higher headquarters allowed Allied planners to schedule C-47 transport planes, coordinate fighter-bomber cover when the weather cleared, and integrate Bastogne's defense into a broader operational counterstroke. In strategic terms, these non-combatant operators became custodians of the town's nervous system under fire. St. Vith, a signal net slows a Panzer spearhead. If Bastogne was the symbolic heart of the American stand, St. Vith was its fragile brain in the first days of the offensive. The town anchored a road and rail junction critical to German panzer movement. Here, signal corps units with WAC personnel manned telephone exchanges and radio relays that tied together engineer roadblocks, artillery groups, and scattered infantry. As Kampfgruppe after Kampfgruppe tried to push through, every hour of delay was priceless. The U.S. command used the still-functioning lines out of St. Vith to orchestrate a textbook elastic defense. Units pulled back before encirclement, recon elements fed real-time reports on German columns, and artillery leapfrogged from one firing position to the next. Women in the switch rooms, physically exhausted, fingers numb in unheated buildings, kept circuits open by constant rerouting, sometimes talking terrified junior officers through basic map reading so they could at least report a grid square accurately before their radios went dead. Technology at the edge, radios, cables, and their limits. The Ardennes fighting laid bare both the strength and fragility of mid-war U.S. communications technology. Portable SCR-300 walkie-talkies allowed frontline platoons to reach battalion HQ, but their VHF signals were line of sight and easily disrupted by terrain and weather, exactly the factors that defined the Ardennes. Wire communications, by contrast, were resilient, hard to jam, and structurally simple, but they demanded constant labor. Installing and repairing field cable meant crawling through snow and shellfire, tasks increasingly shared by women in rear area signal detachments as male manpower thinned. In several documented cases, WAC radio operators used direction-finding sets to identify German transmitters masquerading as American units, exposing deception attempts intended to misroute reserves. The archival logs show terse notations: suspect source, do not relay, written in neat female handwriting beside call signs later confirmed to be enemy. This technical vigilance blunted German efforts to turn Allied communications against themselves. Inside the hospitals, blood, logistics, and hard choices. Behind canvas walls and hastily commandeered schools, the medical war was a logistical nightmare. The German offensive produced mass casualties while simultaneously severing supply lines. Nurses in Ardennes hospitals measured their world in pints of plasma, morphine ampoules, and clean dressings. Surgical teams resorted to reusing equipment sterilized over improvised stoves. Blood shortages forced triage decisions that were as much strategic as medical. A badly wounded rifleman who might fight again in weeks could be prioritized over an already exhausted veteran with little chance of returning to duty. Evacuation routes changed daily, road closures turned rearward movements into deadly gambles. Diaries and after-action medical reports show nurses tracking not just patients but fuel, tires, and even spare bulbs for operating lamps, fully aware that a failed generator could mean losing a whole night's worth of potentially salvageable lives. In this sense, they were both caregivers and frontline logisticians, managing scarcity under bombardment. Individual resolve, a nurse's stand at the perimeter. One repeatedly cited episode in unit histories concerns a small clearing station overtaken by the German advance. When ordered to withdraw, the staff faced the reality that their most gravely wounded could not be moved. Several nurses volunteered to remain. Armed with pistols and a few carbines, they turned the compound into a makeshift strongpoint, organizing able-bodied patients into watch details and assisting engineers in laying mines along the approach road. Strategically, their decision forced the Germans to commit infantry in time to secure what should have been a simple capture of supplies. Biographically, their motives were layered: professional duty, loyalty to their boys, and a defiant refusal to accept the role of passive victims. Post-war testimonies from German soldiers mention astonishment at encountering armed American women directing defenses. While this stand did not alter the campaign by itself, it exemplified how individual moral choices intersected with operational friction, cumulatively slowing the offensive. Economic shadows: why women were there at all. The presence of so many American women close to the front was the outcome of deeper economic and demographic trends. By late 1944, U.S. mobilization had drafted millions of men into combat arms, creating acute shortages in technical and clerical roles. The War Department's solution was dual: mechanize what it could, and recruit women to fill the rest. Training them as nurses, radio operators, typists, and drivers freed male soldiers for rifle companies and tank crews. In the Ardennes, this policy had paradoxical effects. On one hand, it strengthened overall combat power by keeping frontline units manned. On the other, it placed women in zones that planning models still treated as secure, even as German armored doctrine targeted precisely those rear echelons. When the offensive hit, the American war economy was literally present in the form of these women, products of stateside factories, colleges, and hospitals, now functioning as the connective tissue of the front, exposed but indispensable. Weather, air power, and the women who watched the skies. For nearly a week after the German attack, low clouds and snow grounded most Allied aircraft, neutralizing one of their key advantages. Deep in rear area command posts, U.S. weather teams, some including newly trained female meteorological assistants, tracked barometric readings and cloud ceilings with anxious precision. Their forecasts fed directly into operational planning, without a reliable prediction of clearing skies. Commanders hesitated to commit scarce reserves along exposed roads that would be easy prey for the Luftwaffe if the weather broke in Germany's favor first. When, just before Christmas, forecasts finally indicated a window of improved visibility, the impact was immediate. Transport aircraft carrying supplies to Bastogne and fighter bombers hunting German armor lifted off. After-action reports highlight how those few days of air support crippled German logistics. The women plotting isobars and decoding synoptic charts thus sat at a subtle but crucial hinge of the battle's outcome. Psychological strain, letters, censorship, and fear. Away from the guns, other women fought a quieter war over words and morale. Army postal and censorship units, often staffed by WAC personnel, screened letters flowing from the front. During the Ardennes crisis, the tone of that correspondence shifted sharply. References to unexpected attack, heavy losses, and not enough men or guns began to spike. Censors flagged such trends, and their aggregated reports moved up intelligence channels, giving higher headquarters a granular picture of troop anxiety beyond sanitized situation maps. Some women described in later interviews how they read between lines: a soldier's sudden silence about a buddy, the gallows humor that signaled shock. Their work fed into psychological warfare assessments and prompted subtle adjustments in official communiques and stateside propaganda, aiming to support wavering morale without revealing operational vulnerabilities. In this sense, even far from the Ardennes forests, women's emotional labor intersected with strategic decision-making. The German view, underestimating rear echelon resistance. Captured German documents and post-war interrogations revealed that planners of Wacht am Rhein largely discounted resistance from rear area personnel, especially women. Operational orders assumed that once frontline American units were broken, the subsequent exploitation phase would be a dash through disorganized services troops and panicked headquarters staffs. Instead, Panzer columns encountered pockets of determined resistance protecting supply dumps, bridges, and medical sites. Reports from units of the 2nd Panzer Division and 26th Volksgrenadier Division note stubborn delaying actions by small American groups, often including non-infantry personnel. While these accounts rarely single out women, Occasional references to female medical staff remaining with wounded or telephone personnel continuing service under fire hint at how expectations collided with reality. Strategically, every such unexpected stand compounded delays, burning precious fuel and daylight that the Germans could not afford, especially once Allied aircraft returned to the skies. Bastogne relieved, the web holds just long enough. By December 26, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne, ending its complete encirclement. The relief is usually framed in terms of armored thrusts and bold maneuvering, but the operational choreography depended on threads of communication that had survived against the odds. Signal logs show that, despite frequent outages, enough messages about ammunition levels, casualty figures, and road conditions reached higher commands to shape Patton's choices of axis and timing. Within Bastogne, nurses shifted from crisis triage under siege to managing the influx of newly wounded from breakout operations. Their earlier decisions, who to operate on, who to evaluate when a brief corridor opened, now revealed longer-term consequences in the composition of units returning to the line. At the macro level, the German offensive had spent itself. At the micro level, the human infrastructure of the American army, its women included, had bent but not broken, proving the resilience of a mass mobilization system under extreme shock. Recognition deferred, post-war erasure, and fragmentary archives. When the war ended, the narrative of the Battle of the Bulge solidified around male heroism and high command genius. Many women returned home quietly, their service records incomplete or buried in administrative files. The Army Nurse Corps received collective honors, but individual acts, staying with patients under threat of capture, organizing defenses, repairing vital communications, rarely translated into medals. WAC signal women, bound by secrecy about codes and traffic analysis, often could not even tell families what they had done. Archival evidence survives in scattered forms, morning reports noting female personnel remained at posts during shelling, marginalia in Signal Corps logs, and later oral histories recorded by military historians in the 1970s and 1980s. These fragments, when pieced together, reveal a battlefield woven not only from foxholes and tank traps but from switchboards, operating tables, and weather charts, domains where women's labor was essential yet long overshadowed in public memory. Strategy in the rear, how support shapes offense and defense. The Ardennes campaign underscored a basic truth of modern war: strategy is executed not only by generals moving arrows on maps, but by the capacity of support systems to absorb shock. Women in the Ardennes sat inside that support lattice. Switchboard operators who kept a single line open enabled artillery coordination that stalled a German regiment. Nurses who preserved a few dozen lightly wounded riflemen returned those men to companies fighting at half strength. These marginal contributions aggregated into operational effects: a division that could hold one more village, a bridge blown in time because an engineer unit received an order that might otherwise have been lost in the confusion. In retrospect, the U.S. Army's choice to push women into technical and medical roles close to the front allowed a higher tempo of operations, and also forced the institution to confront, however reluctantly, the reality that those roles could be exposed to the same risks as infantry. Gender norms under fire, expectations versus behavior. Prevailing 1940s gender norms framed women as needing protection, not providing it. In training manuals and recruitment posters, WACs and nurses were portrayed as supportive, orderly, and above all feminine. The Ardennes offensive disrupted those expectations. Male soldiers who later wrote memoirs described a jolt of cognitive dissonance when they saw female operators calmly patching calls amid bombardment or nurses insisting on staying with immobile patients as retreat orders came down. In several units, commanders quietly relaxed rules about women carrying weapons once the scale of the German attack became evident. Post-war sociological studies note that many men's attitudes toward women in uniform shifted after such experiences, though those shifts were often compartmentalized and did not immediately translate into broader social equality. Still, in foxholes, cellars, and aid stations, behavior rather than ideology dictated respect. Competence under fire challenged stereotypes in ways no pamphlet campaign could. The broader war, from Ardennes to post-war policy. What happened in the Ardennes fed into longer arcs of military policy. The U.S. Army emerged from World War II with a grudging appreciation of how effectively women had filled technical and medical billets, freeing hundreds of thousands of men for combat. Yet that institutional memory coexisted with an urge to demobilize women quickly after victory, restoring pre-war labor patterns. The tension is visible in early Cold War planning documents that both budget for future female auxiliary corps and hedge against over-reliance on them. Experiences from the Bulge, where women had been caught in an unanticipated offensive, were cited in internal debates about how close to any potential frontline female personnel should be stationed. While true integration into combat roles would take decades, the gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality, exposed so starkly in the winter of 1944-45, became a reference point for later advocates of broader roles for women in the armed forces. Memory, monuments, and the slow return of names. For years, public commemorations of the Battle of the Bulge focused on infantry divisions, armored spearheads, and famous commanders. Only gradually did museums and memorials begin to incorporate stories of women who served in and around the Ardennes. Local European communities sometimes remembered more vividly villagers who had hidden with American nurses and sailors, or whose homes had housed signal detachments, recounted those experiences to visiting veterans and historians. In the United States, unit reunions occasionally invited former WACs and nurses, and their testimonies started to filter into regimental histories. By the late 20th century, specialized exhibits and scholarly works began to foreground their contributions, drawing on declassified records and oral history projects. The process of naming, of attaching individual identities to once anonymous auxiliaries, remains incomplete, but it has reshaped how the campaign is taught, revealing a more complex, gendered landscape of war. Conclusion: the hidden front of the Ardennes. Seen through the lives of these women, the Battle of the Bulge appears less as a clash of tanks in snowy forests and more as a test of a vast, interdependent system under sudden stress. Communications, medicine, logistics, meteorology, and morale, domains where women were heavily represented, proved as decisive as any single engagement at a crossroads. Their work did not fit the traditional image of combat, yet it directly influenced whether orders flowed, wounded men lived, supplies arrived, and commanders understood the battlefield they were trying to shape. The German offensive failed not only because armored thrusts ran out of fuel and met stubborn riflemen, but because the Allied rear, imperfect, shocked, but resilient, did not collapse. In that rear, American women in uniform held lines of their own, often without weapons, sometimes with them, and in doing so helped determine the course of the war's last great gamble in the West.